Logic and mathematics are abstract, immaterial truths that are necessary for rational thought, intentionality, and meaning, without which thoughts would be mere chemical reactions. Morality, which is expected to be binding beyond personal preference, and free will. And herein lies the issue. Take logic. It's not physical. It's not made of stuff, matter, or energy. You can't weigh or measure the law of non-contradiction that A equals A and not B. Yet this very law governs all reasoning. Mathematics, also not made of stuff, not physical. The number 2 exists as an abstract concept. 2 apples can represent 2ness, but they are not 2 itself. Morality, the distinction between right and wrong, isn't made of energy. Yet we recognize moral and objective values and duties. The issue is that within a purely materialistic framework, it cannot justify why these things exist. If you want to be a consistent materialist, you have to admit that none of these can exist, and yet they do. They govern our grasp and comprehension of existence and reality. Even the fundamental principles of science, like causality and induction, remain unexplained in a purely physical framework. Why should cause and effect hold universally? Physics describes how things behave, but not why causality itself is reliable. Why should the future resemble the past? Science assumes it to be true, but under a strict materialistic framework, there is no grounding for such an assumption. Rather than addressing these issues head-on, materialists often insist that logic, math, morality, memory, consciousness, altruism, and meaning just are. They just exist as brute facts.
What I do think is that physicists have discovered a general view about the world which accounts for certain physical processes, which can be expanded into an account of the directionality of all temporal processes. It's a theory about the world. It's part of a theory of everything. And there are many, many microstates that could realize any such macro description, and there's a probability distribution over all of them.
See, these things must be accepted by faith under their worldview, which is ironic given that this particular framework demands empirical evidence from others while often embracing its own untestable faith-like beliefs. See, none of this is actually settled science. Much of it is speculative, unfalsifiable, and in some cases, just as metaphysically theoretical as religious explanations. And speaking of which, why don't we take a look at some of the more speculative ideas within materialistic sciences that are actually quite popular despite having very little physical or empirical evidence or data to support them? How about string theory? A mathematical theory that posits that tiny vibrating strings are the fundamental building blocks of reality.
Tiny and curled up and more difficult to detect, like the circular girth of the wire. Now, what the idea is, according to string theory, is that the fabric of the universe is much like this piece of wire. There can be additional dimensions that are tightly curled up, like the circular girth of the wire, and are so small that we haven't seen them yet, because we don't have sufficient magnifying instruments to actually peer down into the nooks and crannies of the spatial fabric and see these extra dimensions. But string theory says that they absolutely have to be there. There are at least 6, as you mentioned, and quite possibly 7 that are curled up into the fabric of the universe.
It's a very neat concept when you consider it, but it's entirely untestable. What about the many-world interpretation, a theory that posits that parallel universes are responsible for every quantum event?
Taking quantum mechanics and the wave function seriously lets you come up with a theory that does account for the world that we observe. It is not in contradiction with our experience, but what it implies is that there are all these separate copies of reality. These other copies of the world still exist. People don't like that. Okay, you may know, you may have heard of this. People object to the idea that I could hop one way, hop the other way, and there's literally 2 copies of me. Okay?
Certainly fascinating, but completely beyond experimental or observational verification. Varying theories in quantum consciousness. For example, the idea that consciousness arises from quantum effects and brain microtubules.
And so I said, this sounds extremely interesting. There's a much better chance. You have these little tubes, they're very symmetrical structures, they're much smaller. There's a reasonable chance, I didn't see how in detail, but a reasonable chance that here you have something which could preserve quantum coherence up to the level. And yes, this sounded like a really promising idea.
And the transition from the microtubules, where you have maintaining the quantum mechanical effects, to the information being passed through the synapse and the electrical activity.
The strength of the synapses would be controlled by the cytoskeleton, particularly the microtubules, and the microtubules would they'd be in some kind of global coherence.
It definitely sounds profound and complex, but given that there's little to no empirical evidence to support it, I don't see why anybody would waste their time believing in something like this. I could definitely go on, but the point is clear. Many materialistic camps dismiss anything beyond the physical as unscientific.
It's a system of thinking which teaches you not to ask questions. And so I think it's basically incompatible with science.
Yet within their own framework, major theories remain unfalsifiable. They readily embrace speculative ideas so long as they fit their materialistic physical parameters, while rejecting any metaphysical or transcendental concept as irrational. Some might even try to sidestep all of this by claiming that higher realities such as consciousness, morality, and meaning are mere illusions.
Listening to what our best science is telling us, space and time and objects in space and time do not exist when they're not perceived. It's just a headset. So the distinction that we make between living and non-living is not principled. The distinction we make between conscious and unconscious is not principled. It's an artifact of the limitations of our headset.
But if that's true, then the very thoughts and concepts used to defend materialism or physical frameworks are just illusions. And if that is the case, then why should we trust them at all? A truly rational worldview should be able to account for the fundamental realities of existence like logic, consciousness, morality, and meaning. Yet materialism struggles to do so. Strictly materialistic or physical worldviews usually just assume them to be true. They take them for granted without positing any consistent justification for them.
And the only plausible answer is, why not? Why in the world would you ever expect there to be nothing rather than something? It's not the kind of question to which we are ever going to get an answer that says, oh, it's because of this that there is something rather than nothing.
Ultimately, there has to be a brute fact.
Absolutely. I think that brute facts are things we need to accept. The existence of the universe is probably one of them.
The default response is, well, science just hasn't figured it out yet.
It's so obvious the progress that has been made towards understanding the beginning of the universe and the fundamental laws of physics that obviously I don't know the answer. It could be that 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now we'll realize, yeah, that was just too hard. But I see no evidence for that whatsoever.
Translation, blind faith in the future, or the science of the gaps fallacy. Then there's the you too defense. When you point out that materialism is full of contradictions and unjustified presuppositions, they usually dodge with, you can't justify your positions either. Even if another worldview does require justification, that does nothing to resolve materialism's inability to reconcile the presuppositional axioms that it assumes to be true. Or they might even argue something along the lines of, you have to prove the supernatural or transcendental or immaterial exist in the first place.
This is the way naturalism always argues. I mean, the burden of proof is sort of on the other side. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. So we don't have the puzzle of, gosh, where there's smoke, there's fire, where there's so much belief. No, I think we can just set that aside.
Which is just pure evasion. Every worldview must justify foundational and presuppositional claims. If a materialist asserts that only the physical world exists, they must explain how logic, consciousness, time, and morality fit within a purely materialistic framework. Materialism fails to provide those answers. It's not a unified, self-sustaining worldview as it likes to present itself. It's actually a patchwork of assumptions, and if it can't provide a basis or justification for any of its presuppositions, why should anyone even consider this a serious worldview?